Welcome everyone, Costin here with the discussion about dual specking for World of Warcraft Burning Crusade Classic. This is something that quite a large number of people in the community would like to see happen, though this is not something that Blizzard themselves have talked about in any way, shape or form, or indicated in any way, shape or form. There's been no announcements, no posts, no data mining, no leaks to indicate that Blizzard is in any way considering implementing dual spec in TBC Classic. At least as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong on this, but I haven't seen anything at the very least to indicate that Blizzard is at all interested in this. This is something driven by the community. And how many people want this? Well, I've done a poll recently, and based on the results of that poll, close to 70% of people would like to have dual spec in TBC Classic for a variety of reasons. Now, there's all kinds of ideas floating around about how it should be implemented, when it should be available, if at all. Now, I personally don't have a horse in the race. I'm neither for it really or against it. I think there are consequences for having dual spec if Blizzard were to implement dual spec in TBC, but there's also consequences for not having it, actually. And one of the things I would say is that if dual spec is something that Blizzard would implement in TBC, it should be something available from a low level. Why do I say that? Well, one of the problems in the game right now, as far as I'm concerned, is the boosting meta, where people don't really level anymore, but instead they get boosted. Now, based on what we've seen so far in the TBC beta, it does seem like that is going to continue. I mean, people are already soloing slave pens and they're soloing portions of dungeons. They're either just killing the mobs outright on their own and getting a huge amount of experience, or they're doing insane AoE pulls already. Keep in mind, people are not 70 in the beta. We have a level cap of 68. People don't have any raiding gear. Now imagine what level 70 mages with full Karazhan gear, let alone tier 5, tier 6 gear, imagine what people will be able to do when those become available. Then you can understand the issue. Now, part of the problem, in my eyes, as to why this is happening, beyond the fact that it's very efficient and that it's something Blizzard should take a look at in its own right, part of the problem is that that while leveling, there's a significant shortage of tanks and a significant shortage of healers. And this has been true in the beta as well. I mean, granted, many people that got in the beta aren't taking it seriously as well. People that got in it that are like tier 3 geared healers, shamans, druids, priests, doesn't matter. They've gone DPS and messed around and not taking it seriously. I mean, it's not really fun to do dungeons over and over and over again. And if you're questing, you want to be a DPSer, right? So a lot of people right now in the beta, well, they're neither tanking or healing, and there's a severe shortage of healers in particular. And Burning Crusade in its own right is the kind of expansion where if you're doing a dungeon, regardless of how easy these dungeons might seem in the beta, we've done them with proper tank specs and proper healing specs. I mean, I only did one dungeon with a healer that was DPS spec, and it wasn't the greatest run, so to speak. I'm sure you can manage some of it, but it's not a great experience to do it without. So here's the thing. There's a shortage of healers, there's a shortage of tanks, and that's because obviously you want people to be proper specs for dungeons, but people also want to be DPS while they're leveling. So if you allow dual spec while leveling, it would help alleviate some of the problems when it comes to a shortage of tanks and healers while leveling. It would certainly help the community, it would improve the community, it would push people in a direction of doing dungeons together in a good way, as opposed to something like an LFG tool, one that like we have on retail, where you just queue up for a dungeon, the game sets up the group for you, you get instantly teleported. That's a bad way of making dungeon groups. Just giving people the opportunity to be able to quest while DPS and then heal or tank because of a dual spec is beneficial for the community during that part of the game. Of course, at max level, things do stand very differently. I mean, there's still a benefit in having dual spec in terms of getting tanks or healers, because people might want to have a second spec to farm or to PvP, right? People that are raiders, people that are tanks, people that are healers, or even people that are DPSers might just run like a tank off spec, or they might run with a healing off spec for the sake of 5-man dungeons, because there's always that shortage. So there might be a benefit in getting more dungeon groups running if people have dual specking. For PvP, however, and one of the main arguments I've seen in favor of dual specking, it would be beneficial in terms of being able to PvP without having to spend a certain amount of gold or going through the annoyance of having to respec. But I don't really buy that argument, to be quite honest about it. I also don't think it would really help the community in any way, shape, or form. If you're going to PvP, you're going to PvP regardless. Sure, it might be frustrating having to respec, spend the gold, and feel like you're locked in because you don't want to spend 100 gold or 200 gold whenever you want to PvP. So you might just like have your 2 raiding days one after another and then PvP for the rest of the week. But then you're not just going to swap willy-nilly between your specs. With a dual spec might help some people in that, especially hardcore PvPers, but for the overall community, I don't think it would matter. I think a lot of raiders, if you gave them the opportunity to have a dual spec, they would have a second PvE spec, not really a PvP spec. Most of them. Not all of them, of course. Again, hardcore PvPers. Maybe there would be some people that would take the opportunity to have to PvP using it on a more casual level, but I don't think this would have a significant impact, really, from that perspective. Less frustrating for the people that care about it, absolutely, no denying that. But overall, when it comes to the PvP community, I don't think it would really matter all that much. When it comes to raiding, however, well, I would say this about respecking. And I would say this about the whole idea of like going to a trainer, spending the gold, having to rearrange your action bars, all that kind of stuff. There are already guilds, or have been guilds, on private servers, and I very much assume this will happen in Classic TBC as well. But there are guilds already that what they do, they go to a boss like, say, Nagentus. The trash to Nagentus requires 3 tanks. Nagentus himself only requires 1 tank. So what do you do then? Oh, you swap people in and out, or you get people to respec more often than not. Now, respecking in itself is not a major issue these days. There are add-ons, and I assume there will be add-ons to TBC Classic, that can help you out. There's Talented, for instance, just an example, Action Bar Saver, Talented. Some add-ons might not have been updated, but when it comes to respecking, we are not as we were back in the day. It's very quick, very simple, very efficient to do it. You can have an add-on that saves your talent profiles. You can have an add-on that saves your action bars. And gold, the gold aspect about it, meaningless really, because if you're respecking in the middle of the raid, chances are that the guild bank is going to pay for it in most guilds, right? Especially if you're in a sweaty tryhard guild that really cares about having someone tank respec for the sake of, say, Nagentus or Terran Gorefiend. That is a factor, and it's not time consuming either. I mean, a mage putting a portal for a city where you can get to a trainer very quickly, and then a warlock summoning. Well, let's say the warlock starts summoning you the moment that mage puts the portal and you take it. You can be back by the time that summon expires, especially if you have the gear in your bags, if you have add-ons for it. You can be very quick, very efficient. Not a problem at all to respect that. So does it really matter to have a dual spec if people can already do this? The answer to that is yes, it does. Because right now, and I assume as things stand right now, sure, some guilds will have like their prop paladin or their prop warrior or whoever, right? They might have some people respecking on certain boss encounters because they're that sweaty. Some guilds, some very tryhard guilds, some parsing guilds, right? They might care about, people who care about boss parses might do that. But for the most part, it's not something that would become widespread. If Blizzard were to introduce dual specking, and this is the major issue, it would change the community and would make this kind of behavior far more widespread than it will be or should be if you don't have dual specking in the game. Now, I could be wrong on this. The community might become that sweaty. I mean, we've certainly seen people mandating world buffs in things like Molten Core. Absolutely. There is a ridiculous level of tryhard, even in pugs in Classic right now. And part of that is an influence from the retail community. But I do feel very strongly that if dual spec were to be introduced, this kind of behavior of swapping people in and out or having people respec for bosses constantly, like You go from one boss that requires a tank to a boss that requires 2 tanks to a boss that requires 3 tanks, all that. There's plenty of boss encounters like this in Burning Crusade. There's many, many encounters in TBC where you might go from, like, say, Hydros requires 4 tanks, Lurker 2 to 3 tanks, Leofrast 2 tanks, Carafrest 4 tanks, Morgrim 2 tanks, 3 tanks maybe at most, Vash 1 or 2 tanks. So you have like a weird boss situation where bosses require different setups, and that's just the tanking, let alone the DPSing, let alone the healing. There are bosses that require more healers. And if Blizzard were to introduce this kind of change, what would happen is it would become widespread and accepted and the norm. Now, for my part, I am thoroughly against it. I've always despised this idea of having someone being forced to respec to something. Like, I didn't join a guild, for my part, I don't join a guild as a DPS. I join a guild as a tank. I want to tank. I don't want to maintain a retribution spec and then be forced to do it like whenever my guild gets to a particular boss where they don't want me to tank. And I'm sure that's the case as well for many, many other people. And I think that introducing this change, introducing dual spec, regardless of how it's done. Some people attack, introduce some limits, require people to go to a trainer. That's irrelevant. If you have dual spec, this is going to happen regardless. Regardless of if there's some kind of gold cost, regardless if there's some kind of delay, it doesn't matter. People will still use it on a far larger scale than they would otherwise, than they would force people otherwise to respec at the trainer. But it might not matter. I could be wrong in judging the community. I could be wrong in how widespread mandatory respecking for certain bosses is going to be. That's where I stand on this issue. And these are the kind of things to consider. It's not all sunshine and bunnies. It's not like introducing dual specking in the game would be just a net benefit. There is a net benefit, I feel, while leveling, but at max level when it comes to raiding, there are many downsides to consider as well. But I think when it comes to it, at the end of the day, it depends on the community. If the community is going to be very try-hard, if they're going to do it regardless, if they're going to force, if it's going to be mandatory pretty much in every raid to do this kind of stuff on a widespread scale, then I don't think it matters that much, right, in that kind of context. If that's not the case, then Blizzard should tread carefully with things like this. And there are many things, many potential changes, many things that Blizzard could implement in the older versions of the game, many things that they did end up implementing on retail that did have a negative impact, even if people didn't realize it back then. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.